All right. Thank you all for coming this afternoon. Thanks for taking time out of your reading week to join us. I'm Dawson Wainman. I'm the Director of Student Life for the Frost Student Association. Co-hosting with me tonight is Adam Folland, the President of the Frost Student Association. And our special guest this evening is Katrina Van Osch-Saxon, who's here to present her talk, Sow, Grow, Preserve, Eat, Repeat. Please take it away.
Thanks, Dawson, and thanks all for joining me this evening. I'm really excited to be here and to chat with you about growing and preserving your own food. Before I begin, I would just like to note that Fleming College respectfully acknowledges that the college is situated on Mississauga lands and the traditional territory covered by the Williams Treaty and Treaty Number 20. I have been preserving food for over 20 years, but in the last few years, and especially this past year, I've definitely upped my preserving game, to say the least. And that was because of a number of factors. And it just so happened, actually, that we experienced COVID at a time when I was really starting to look at preserving more of our own food. And so what I hope tonight is not so much to teach you anything, really, although you may learn a few things, but to inspire you to take control of your own food supply. And so the title of this talk is Sow, which means to start and start your own seeds and grow your own garden, preserve the food or some of the food that you grow, eat what you grow and what you preserve, and then repeat that process through things like seed saving or just making it a part of your annual routine. And I don't expect everyone to become a homesteader overnight. I surely didn't. I'm 45 years old, so it took me this long to kind of build up my preserving skills. But tonight I am going to teach you a little bit about the history of food preservation, why we preserve food, how we preserve food, the best resources, which is key to all of this. And if you take anything away tonight, I hope it's that you remember the resources, and I've included the links to help you with that. What you can preserve, when you can preserve, the tools required for preservation of all different kinds, where to get the food to preserve, how to store the food you preserve, food safety, which I'm sure is top of the list for a lot of people, or it should be, and then basically how to get started. And so the way I look at food has changed, especially over the past, I would say, 10 years. And I have tried to live by the saying, or the idea of banning the barcode, and that real food doesn't come with a label. And I'm not saying every piece of food in your home could have a barcode on it, but just remembering that real food can be easy. It's not always easy, but it can be. And so trying to make better choices about eating food that you know where it came from is something that has become more and more important for a variety of reasons. So I'm going to cover that as I go through the chat tonight. See if I can make this thing work. So a little bit about the history of food preservation. And as you all know, food will start to spoil as soon as it's harvested. And so for the most part tonight, I'm going to be talking about fruits and vegetables because we're all familiar with it, but that also includes meat. And so when you harvest a piece of food, a fruit, a vegetable, whatever, and it is removed from the plant, or once it is ripened, bacteria and fungi, but mainly bacteria, thrive on the moisture of that food and begin to break it down or to spoil it. And so imagine me, all of these tomatoes on these two kind of florets all come ripe at the same time. Imagine me trying to mow them all down so that they don't go to waste. It's nearly, well, I'm sure I could do it, but it would be, I wouldn't feel good after. And so in the early times when food was harvested, it was preserved in a number of ways. And the indigenous peoples were the first to explore different ways to preserve food when they traveled between places. They needed it to be light. And so food was dried with the sun, which was free most of the time, smoked on fire, or frozen on ice. Those were the three main ways that food was preserved. And then it was also made into other types of food where you mixed some of these ingredients, so maybe meat, berries, and animal fat, into something called pemmican, or other different ways to preserve food. And so fast forward to where we are now, we have a lot of different systems that we can use for food preservation. But these were some of the most simple ways that food was preserved early on, when we didn't have the luxuries of the modern world. So I should tell you that all of the pictures in this presentation are mine, except for a few, which I will let you know. So when I decided to, or when I offered to give this talk, I quickly ran down into my pantry and unearthed all of these jars and some of the things that I think are basically are the foundation for preserving food. So let's talk about why we preserve food, because really, I don't know why anyone would go to all of the work that is required in food preservation if there wasn't a really great reason. So I'm going to talk about all of the things that are here in this picture later in the presentation. So don't worry, I will explain what these all are in future slides. So one of the real reasons why we preserve food is to extend the bounty, so that you can enjoy these nutritious types of food throughout the year. And preserving slows the spoiling process by restricting the growth of microorganisms, specifically bacteria, but also fungi. We do it because we ensure the quality of the food that we're eating. So this massive mound of kale, times about 10 times or 12 times over the summer, finds itself on my counter, and there's no way that I can eat all that kale in one sitting. And so if I blanch it and freeze it, or dry it, or bake it into chips and prolong the use of that kale, then I know that I am still able to get quality food that's organic and pesticide free for a longer period of time. So the quality of food, I know where it came from. I know how it was grown. I understand its origins and how, what went into growing that food. So it's about quality. It's about food security. And I can say for this year that when, and this was just coincidence, but when we went into lockdown, there was no time that I needed to visit a grocery store. I could go as long as a month or even longer without going to a grocery store, because I had a secure food source because of my preservation. And like I said, it would just happen to be. But that's why people preserve food like they do. Sustainability. So many pillars of sustainability can be supported through food preservation, and I'll talk about a lot of them. But really, if you can grow your own food, you have made your food source sustainable. If you have the ability to grow a garden, if you have the ability, and this isn't for everyone, I understand, but if you can hunt, or if you can fish, if you're a meat eater, then you have taken control of your food supply. You can also reduce food waste. So a lot of people throw away a ton of food that they have purchased at the grocery store because they don't have that personal connection with growing the food. And I can tell you, it is very difficult to throw food away if you have spent all of the hours starting the seed, growing the plant on, harvesting the food. It's really difficult to throw away. So I think that is also what spurs me to keep my food. Whereas if people have purchased food from a grocery store, I'm not saying it's easy, but I think it's a little bit easier because you don't have the connection with the food that you would have had. Like, I watched every single one of those leaves develop from start to this moment. So I take great care in food preservation. And I really try not to let it go to waste. And if it does go to waste, it goes into my compost. So we all know it's really not waste. Food preservation reduces waste of packaging hugely. Before I preserve so much, I used to put out a blue box with plastics and other recyclable materials that came from food packaging all of the time. Now I'm lucky if I do every month for blue box, just because I reuse all my jars. Really, the waste is in the snap lids. And then cost. So the initial cost I'll talk to you about tonight, because some of the tools are quite expensive. The initial cost can be staggering, but if you're doing things like freezing, most people have a freezer, so you just have to get some kind of receptacle to freeze your items in. But if you are canning, then a water bath canner is fairly reasonable. Pressure canner is much more expensive, but after you have that outset cost from the start, you save a ton of cash because most of the things are reusable, which is super handy. So you do save money. So you may have heard the term put it up. And if you haven't, putting up means storing and preserving. So these beets, for example, were my first harvest of beets this year. And so this day I remember very clearly because I made this beautiful kind of ring of delicious beets. And I talked to my husband about putting it up and how excited I was to kind of start the process again this year. So how do we put it up? And there are so many different things that you can do to preserve or to put up. And you are all probably already doing this in some form or another, whether you preserve it for a week in your fridge. So if you go to the grocery store and you put something in your fridge, you're putting up. If you put it in your freezer, you're putting up for a little bit longer. If you ferment or you can, you pickle, or you pressure can, then you're putting it up for a longer period of time. So really, I'm just going to talk to you about the different ways that we put up and what might work for you in the future if you're not doing it already. So the first way we put it up, like I said, is cold storage. And one of the earliest ways that people stored food was in things like root cellars. So this is Bonavista, Newfoundland, where they're known for their root cellars, and they are incredible feats of architecture and food storage. And people have been using these for centuries. And so root cellars work best when the temperatures can be maintained between 0 and 4 to 4.5 degrees Celsius. Because the food doesn't actually freeze, but is kept cold enough that the bacteria basically stop reproducing. So the food is kept. You may be familiar also with ice houses, so where large chunks of ice were kind of cut out of lakes and things like that, stacked and packed with straw so that they could keep food cold. And then fast forward a couple hundred years to our new modern age technology, the use of refrigerators and freezers. But I can tell you that a root cellar is in the works here at our house, because we just don't have the cold storage required to store all of the root vegetables that I want to keep. And so we are going to build a root cellar in the future so that we can just add that to our arsenal of food preservation techniques. So you can dehydrate. And this is a picture of, I grew these tomatoes called Sweet Millions. And the name is spot on because I had six cherry tomato plants, and I'm sure I had over 1 million cherry tomatoes. And I reached a point where I was like, I don't even know what I'm going to do with these things. So I dehydrated them. And this dehydrator was like a cheap, I can't even remember actually where I got it, if it was like Zeller's ears. I'm not really sure. But I remember spending about $40 on it. And we've had it for at least 20 years and it still keeps on ticking. So it's entry level for sure. There are way more expensive and better dehydrators, but honestly, I think it works. So I'm going to use this until it breaks. But anyways, so this is simulating sun-dried, right? You have all heard of sun-dried tomatoes. This is the same thing, right? Just air-dried or heat-dried tomatoes. And then I pack these in olive oil and pull them out when I make things like pesto that I've made with my kale and the basil that's grown in the garden. So dehydration is a really great way to preserve food. I make jerky a lot, so goose, bear, and venison jerky. So lots of different things that you can dehydrate: your herbs, kale, basically you name it, you can dehydrate it. Fruits, veg, just about anything you can dehydrate. If you like the flavor, go for it. The best way to learn about what you like is just to try it, especially if you have extras. Water bath canning is, I would say, if you're entry level, never preserved anything, and you want to try your hand at something more than using the fridge or the freezer, water bath canning is my next recommendation. These are pickled beets that I did this year. And water bath canning is very specific. So your food has to meet specific criteria in order to use water bath canning. So the principle of water bath canning is that you fill a large pot with water, about 3/4 of the way full. It has basically a little grate that goes on the bottom that protects the jar from the boiling action of the bottom of the pan. And then you place your filled jars in, and they have to be filled with hot food items and some kind of liquid. So in this case, it's a sugar vinegar brine with a specific recipe. But in order to use water bath canning, you have to be using high acid foods or high acid content. So the vinegar, beets on themselves would have to be canned using a different method, which I'll talk about here. But with the vinegar solution, that is a high enough acidic component. So it has to be a pH of 4.6 or lower to can using water bath canning. And basically what happens is, as the water boils and heats up to 100 degrees Celsius, that boiling action creates the boiling action pushes excess air out of that top clear space. So this area up here, we call that in the canning world headspace. It pushes any of the remaining air out of the headspace. This seal at the time isn't on 100% tight, it's just hand tight. So air escapes out of here, creating a vacuum as the jar cools after you've canned it. And so this awesome rubberized seal forms. So water bath canning can be used for any high acid food. And I'm going to give you a resource here because you're surely not going to get out your pH meter to determine, yeah, tomatoes and salsa, Adam, you're right. So you're not going to get out a pH meter ever to determine whether your food is going to be water bath can or pressure canning. So I'm going to show you some resources. It's not a guessing game ever. It should never be a guessing game. The next type of canning that is pretty new to me this year is pressure canning. And it's not super new to me, but it was new to me this year because I finally bit the bullet and purchased this item here, which is an all-American pressure canner. So this is where you up the ante as far as finances are concerned. But I can tell you the difference between like pickling and water bath canning and pressure canning is being able to feed myself nearly 100% without a grocery store, because you can every single low acid food, vegetable, meat, or other, using this instrument. So this, I think, and now I can't exactly remember, but it was around $490. But if you take care of it, you will have it for life. This is a weighted gauge, so I'm missing from the picture a little circular weight that would fit on top of that little nipple at the top of the canner. And that basically determines, it's based on height above sea level pressure, and to maintain the pressure in the canner. So any high acid, so anything with a pH of 4.6 or higher can be pressure canned. And basically the reason why you need to use a pressure canner is to kill the botulism bacteria, Clostridium botulinum, which is a bacteria that grows in low oxygen, no oxygen environments like canned food. and especially thrives on things like potatoes, which you see here in the picture. And so a pressure canner allows the temperature to build above that 100 degrees. So you can see here 116 degrees Celsius for a long period of time. So some of these food things that I'm going to talk about, these foodstuffs, are canned for 90 minutes, which is a long, it's like an hour and a half, right? So it's a long time, and that doesn't include warm up or cool down time. And so that time period allows for the potential, if there was any botulinum in those cans or those jars, that it would be killed. So this is definitely by far the smartest decision I ever made. These are really difficult to get a hold of right now because of COVID. So that's okay. That means you have time to start saving to buy yourself a pressure canner. I look at it as an upside. Fermenting. So Dawson was talking about the fact that he just started lacto fermentation this year. And fermenting is, if you're also looking for an easy way into food preservation, fermentation is so easy and takes you to rock star status as far as food flavors are concerned. And so I started with, and am now like a super crowder, I would call myself. I started with making sauerkraut because it literally is the easiest food to ferment. You cut it up, you add a specific measurement of salt, and really it's pretty easy. 1 tablespoon per like medium to large head of cabbage, and that's as difficult as it gets. And then you kind of massage the cabbage with the salt, and that allows the cabbage to kind of break those cells and release its natural juices, which then the lactobacillus bacteria grows on the sugars and starches released, producing this delicious, crunchy sauerkraut that you can then enjoy for months. So the process actually is done on a countertop in the jar that you see here. And before this lid goes on, this lid that looks like a baby bottle, it has a nipple and there's a hole right there. So as the gases build up from the lactobacillus respiring, so releasing gases, it kind of bubbles, and all of those gases are released from the jar. And once the fermentation process kind of slows down, it usually takes about 7 days in my house. It depends on the temperature in your house. Adam, I'm going to get, too bad it's COVID times. If we see each other before the end of the semester, I'll give you some. So once the fermentation process slows down, or you reach the flavor that you like. So that's key, right? You're doing all this because you actually are committing to eating it. So you want to enjoy the food that you create. So when you try it and it meets your kind of expectations or requirements, then you are going to cap it. And I have discovered, I don't know why it took me so long, but Ball makes these amazing reusable lids. So instead of using the rings that come with the containers and reusing the jar lids, I just reuse these. They don't tarnish, they don't rust, and they are, yeah, Juliet says game changer, totally, a total game changer. So when it's ready, you then put it in the fridge, and that slows down the fermentation process almost to nil, and we'll keep that food. And I don't know, I think I have 1 jar of unopened, it's this jar actually, of unopened sauerkraut that I made at least a month ago. But this is a 1.5 liter, I believe, jar. They're the giant mason jars. And so I usually make about 4 of those at a time, and they just sit in my fridge in waiting for us to eat them. So talk about food preservation. And so I'll talk to you about where I get the cabbage, because in the wintertime, you don't really have a choice. You have to go to the grocery store. So I preserve grocery food. I don't care where it comes from. I do have preferences, but if I want to preserve food, I will get it from the grocery store. I will grow it. I'll talk about that in a minute. So I should say that fermentation, lactofermentation, requires salt or a salt brine. I also ferment pickles. That's one of my other favorites. So pickles, you create a salt brine, which is a water salt mix that you then put the pickles in, and then you push them down. So I should explain. Actually, no, I'll keep going. I'll talk about the the tools in a minute. If you have questions as I'm going, please just chuck them in the chat, and I will, I'll monitor that as I go. I'm a little bit of a goldfish when it comes to presenting and having the chat on. I can't keep focused. So I did talk about the resources required for any of this, and I am a book person. I love books. I like to have them in front of me. I do like to use technology, but I'll tell you, when I find a good recipe, I print it and I put it in a binder with those sheet protectors. So I'm a super geek that way. But I do love books. So use your resources. These are the books that I use. So the fermentation guide, this book here, this book is written by one of, I would say, the planet's best fermenters. His name is Sander Katz. This is the second edition. If you want to learn all about fermenting and different foods, this is the book for you. I'm sure there are other great books on fermenting like this one. This book actually came with my fermenting tools. So I bought the, they're called mason tops. So I bought the nipple tops. It comes with a wooden plunger that allows you to press the food down into the jar. It comes with the pebbles, that little glass thing you saw, and the book with some simple recipes. These old babies, those were hand-me-downs from either my husband's aunt or maybe one of my grandparents. I still use them. So I don't ever throw all the good ones away. If they've been doing it for this long and it's worked, we should just keep doing it. But this book here is the master, and it has everything for pressure canning, preserving, and water bath canning. So if you can't find it in this book, if you want to make something and you can't find it in this book, I would be surprised. It has hundreds of canning recipes, and you may also hear it called the Ball Blue Book. If you have a family member that you know doesn't preserve, ask if they have a copy of the Ball Blue Book. And if they don't use it, beg, borrow, and steal it so that you don't have to buy it. Yeah, Nick, that's awesome. He is. He's so good. Okay, so if you take nothing else away from this talk, write this down. So this is the best resource for learning how to can, ferment, water bath can, pressure can. It has notes for educators. So people like us who want to teach other people. I actually haven't looked at the for educators section. I just saw it when I snipped this picture. So this picture I did take right off the internet just to show you, kind of give you an idea of what you were looking for. But this is where I go all the time. So how do I? So when I want to check, especially for pressure canning, because you want to get it right every single time, I click can. It takes me to what I'm canning. So is it meat? Is it broth? Is it vegetable? Is it fruit? Who knows what it is? It's got it there. And then how I want to preserve it. They talk about freezing. They talk about drying, curing, and smoking, fermenting, pickling, jam, and jelly. So if it's not in here, then odds are you shouldn't be trying to preserve it. That's kind of my motto. And so they talk about how long to pressure can, how you should prepare the food to pressure can, what you should be looking for in food to pressure can. So honestly, if you remember nothing else, the National Center for Home Food Preservation is the resource that you should remember, especially if you choose to you leave Fleming and you're like, oh my gosh, just start Google home food preservation or food preservation, and this will come up. Obviously, YouTube is a fantastic resource, and now that I have a lot of, I would say a lot of experience canning, I do use YouTube a lot to get ideas, recipes, but I always make sure I cross-check or I verify my sources. So if I'm watching a recipe on YouTube, I check to make sure it's either on here or in a book or something close to it so that I know it's going to be safe to eat. And so just make sure you do your research. That is my another important take home point. So if somebody's handed you a handwritten recipe, which I'm going to show you an example of here, see to make sure that it is going to be safe for you to reproduce and that you're following all of the rules for preservation. But honestly, we could end this talk right here, and I could tell you just go do some homework at the National Center for Home Food Preservation, and you would be in good hands. So your other and my dearest resource are our friends and our family members. So my grandparents preserved, my husband's grandparents and aunts preserved, and our dear friend Sophie Horpenach, which is the person that wrote this recipe, was the one that got me starting food preservation a million years ago. Not really, but you know, a long time ago when my husband and I were first married. We wanted to try and reproduce Sophie Horpenach's magical dill pickles. And so this was the recipe. All of us can appreciate the beautiful cursive writing. The note in caps, do not use this brine again or pickles will wilt. So, you know, all of those important notes that you need for a good result. And these recipes like this are becoming harder and harder to find because they're just lost over the generations. So again, if you have family members that are into preserving and it's something that you want to do, I highly recommend photocopying these beautiful, like photocopy, what am I talking about? Take a picture with your phone and keep that recipe. I have some photocopies. I have some original, you know, blue ink handwritten with all the little notes and splashes from the preserving process, but those will get lost if you don't preserve them. So preserve those memories and those recipes for future generations. So let's talk about what you can, no pun intended, preserve. So I know you're probably all looking at this and some of you are probably thinking, oh my goodness, is that chicken? And the answer is yes, it is. Actually, this is a piece of salmon that Brian got while he was fishing. So that's flying for dinner. But this is 3 whole chickens processed and prepared for canning. This is the offcuts that I will then freeze and use for chicken stock that I also pressure can. And so it can be, I guess, kind of gross, but if you've ever eaten any kind of canned meat, for those meat eaters in the crowd, if you have ever eaten canned meat, that includes tuna, then you have eaten food that has been preserved in this process. And you have trusted the fact that because it comes in a can with a label, that it is safe. And that is always the case. Well, I would say 99.9% of the case. But canned foods that we buy in the grocery store have just as much probability of having botulinum as these do, as if you follow the proper process. So what can you preserve? I'm going to go through this quickly. Obviously, our vegetables. So these pickling cucumbers got turned into fermented pickles. The beans, I canned them, I froze them, and I made dilly beans. So 3 things. And I have a bit of a problem with growing green beans. I always grow way too much. It's a problem. Be destroyed. So botulism can be destroyed. It's really difficult, Adam, because you have to reach a higher temperature than 100 degrees. So if it's baked, yes, but stovetop, you have to cook the life right out of it. So yes, but you have to cook it really well. I would err on the side of caution. If you think there is ever a potential for having botulism, get your gloves on and make sure you dispose of the food safely. So I wouldn't even think about cooking anything out of anything that I've canned if I suspect botulism. And I will talk about that in the last slide for you. So meat, you can. So here's the chicken. That's what the chicken looks like after it's canned. And I eat this very regularly. Actually, don't have as much as I would like, but it is super fast. You just dump it out of there, warm it up, and away you go. You can add sauces. So we made butter chicken the other week with canned chicken, and it was amazing. This here is venison that Brian harvested this year. This is venison broth that we made using the bones from the venison that Brian harvested. We like to use as much as we can of the animal because we don't take that that lightly when you take an animal's life. And so you owe it to the animal for giving its life and use as much as you possibly can. And here is an example of basically a meal that you would prepare. So this is tomato meat sauce made with tomatoes from our garden and a bunch of other vegetables and venison that we harvested. So I should also say that we don't buy meat ever from a grocery store unless, I don't even know why I would buy meat. I'm trying to think. I'm just making sure that that's a true statement. Yeah, no, we don't. So we will buy any meat that we don't harvest ourselves or that we don't grow ourselves from friends who grow their own pork or friends who raise chickens at this point. So I really try not to buy meat from a grocery store. But that took a long time to reach that goal. So that wasn't overnight either. You can can fruit. So this is the best secret about canning fruit. So whenever you read any recipe, it says, make sure you buy blemish-free or you're using blemish-free fruit. Well, that is very limiting especially if you get your fruit from the grocery store. So this is a picture of peaches that I got. I'm from Niagara, that I got in Niagara last year when it was peach season. And if you go to the grower, especially in Niagara on the Lake, they will always have these massive boxes of off fruit that have like bruises like this and I don't know, imperfections. You can see all these bruises. They're starting to go pretty quickly. So you have to commit to preserving these quickly, but you just cut that part off and then away you go, especially if you're making jam. So with these, I froze the peaches for just to take them out and have fresh or, like defrosted like peach slices. You can can them. I didn't, but I did make a ton of peach jam. So that is our guilty pleasure. So, and we don't buy jam. So whatever I can make, usually I make rhubarb jam and peach jam and those two, and sometimes strawberry. And those kind of take us through the year. So fruit is quite easy to preserve. You can preserve meals. So when I asked before if you preserved, it doesn't necessarily mean food that you grew or that you purchased, but also things that you can make ahead of time. So these are all meat pies in the weight for venison meat pies. This is actually, it's a trio of ground meat. So it's got ground goose, ground venison, and bear all in one. And that's lasagna. Here I have curry squash soup. I still have about 30 butternut squash on my floor in the basement. I squash overload this year. So you can preserve meals. You can even pressure can meals. So as long as it doesn't have any thickening agent, so like flour or cornstarch, or is super heavy like squash soup, you can preserve it. So the texture of what you're preserving matters. The heat has to be able to penetrate the entire food in order to make sure that all of the bacteria or potential bacteria is killed and the air is removed. But again, you just go to the National Center for Food Preservation and it will tell you whether you can preserve that meal or not. And this is a great way, preserving meals is a great way to kind of prepare you for, school semesters and work and busy weeks and things like that. So this is a picture of Brian and I, who is my husband. Of course, he would have to be somebody close to me for me to get that close. But this is my husband and I under our Scarlet Runner trellis this summer with our sunflowers. And I think this is the time of year where people typically think, yes, I'm going to preserve all this food. And that is true because literally for an entire month straight in the summertime, I preserve something every single day. So I go through my garden and I say, okay, tomorrow's pickles, this day's beans, this day's corn, this day's potatoes, you know, whatever the case may be. And every single day I'm preserving something, or I'm harvesting and ready to preserve it. So the answer to when can you preserve food is basically any time of year. So in the spring, you have things like rhubarb. And for those of you who grow rhubarb or know somebody who does, it's one of the most prolific plants on the planet. My rhubarb is larger than me sometimes. Sometimes I just get so overwhelmed by it. One minute it's like a foot high, and the next it's 8 feet. And you just have so much rhubarb. So you can make jam, you can freeze it, you can can it. You can harvest things like wild leeks. So I also love to forage, and wild leeks are one of the spring delicacies. They should not be harvested in large numbers, so we only ever take enough for one little treat, but we don't harvest a ton. I will say that if you're going to harvest leeks, leave some for Mother Nature. Wild turkey. So if you are a turkey hunter, you can. One of my biggest beefs about people who are hunters, yeah, that's it. So 20% of any patch. That's a good rule, Dawson. I like that. I think I take about 2% of ours, so I think I'm safe. But that's a really great. That's a good number to kind of go by. Less is more in the world of wild leeks for sure. And if you are a turkey hunter, a lot of turkey hunters will just harvest the breast of the bird, but I am, again, a firm believer in making sure you use the whole thing. So I then roast them and then turn them into stock using the meat that are on the legs. That tends to be a lot tougher. After that cooking process for a long period of time, it becomes super tender. So you just add that to your soup. So, and then garlic scapes, although they're a little bit more like we're on the shoulder season of summer for garlic scapes. So there's lots of things that you can preserve in the spring when you're itching. Do you believe in cutting off the bulb? I'm just reading your message here, Dawson. I know some people say only take the leaf, but others say they will grow back fine regardless. So they divide their bulbs. So they divide under the ground. So as long as you leave some, they will divide and continue to grow. So again, it's the amount that you harvest. You're not going to do a full-on, removal of all of the leeks. I'm very selective. So I try and take a few from every patch instead of a large area of one patch. So you have to be really careful. I'm definitely not the expert on wild leeks, but I do harvest sustainably, and I think everyone should do that, especially if it grows in nature. Like anything, it is not an unlimited resource, as we have learned over and over and over again. So summer, of course, this is the busy time, but this was actually a new grow for me this year. I grew cantaloupe for the first time. I've always loved cantaloupe, and I'm not sure why it didn't dawn on me sooner, but man, what a sweet surprise growing cantaloupe was. Super easy, beautiful, large fruit, super delicious, juicy, just incredible, low maintenance, and a ton of fruit. So but the problem was they all came ripe at the same time. So I had this plethora of cantaloupe. So I just cored it, cubed it, and froze it. So now every week I just go down, and instead of buying fruit from the grocery store, I just eat cantaloupe. And if you frozen berries or whatever, you can make a really sweet bowl of berries for yourself in the morning. And then another picture. So this year we planted fruit trees, pear trees, and apple trees, 21 different ones at our place here. So these were the first two fruit, and they actually fell off the tree, but I ate them because that's why you grow things, right? Especially fruit and vegetables. So you can also preserve fruit and meat in the summertime. So a lot of people will produce chickens over the summer, meat birds. So if you can get your hands on some homegrown meat birds, you can preserve that meat, and literally that means putting it in the freezer, right? Or you can do like me and can it. The reason pressure canning is also so awesome is because you require no energy after the canning process to store it. so you don't require a freezer. And if I were to lose one of my freezers, then I would still have meat. My sister and brother-in-law lost their freezer a couple of years ago and lost like over $1,000 in meat. So that's a heartbreaker. If you don't know, your freezer usually doesn't have an alarm or anything. And then in the fall, so this is when we harvest our potatoes, our onions, our squash, fruit, vegetables, venison. If you are a deer hunter or a moose hunter, this is the time of year where you might be doing that. And so you can see this is the first time I grew potatoes this year, and I was tickled at the number of potatoes that we grew. It was just like, it blew my mind of just how easy it was. And so these we stored in boxes, in cardboard boxes in our basement. And then when I started, we ate most of them, but when I started to see some of them going, yeah, they are a ton of fun to harvest, Nick. When we started to see them going wrinkly, then I peeled them and canned them. So a lot of people would have just been like, oh, they're bad, so we have to like eat mashed potatoes for 100 days. But I just peeled them, canned them, and then that preserves them for at least another year or longer. Yeah, Nick, it's like digging for gold. It was like digging for gold, but you would have thought I was finding gold when I found a potato. Honestly, the facial features would have looked the exact same. So this year I'm trying to grow my own sweet potatoes. So I've started slips. We'll see where they go, but I'm imagining that's going to be just as exciting as harvesting potatoes. And then in the winter, so a lot of people would think that winter is not a time for food preservation, but it absolutely is. So anytime we generate bones, I put them in an old milk bag, like the bags that you get milk in, like the big bags if you buy bagged milk. I don't know if I'm making any sense, but anyways, put it in a plastic bag or a bag of some kind. And keep those bones. And I honestly am not picky as far as chicken, rabbit, venison, whatever bones, they all go together and I make bone broth. It's just easier for me. But if you're picky, you can separate them out into chicken and or red meat broth and white meat broth or whatever you might want to do. But bone broth is so healthy and super easy to make. I also, so these actually, I just pulled them out of the basement to take this picture for everyone. But this is what these vegetables look like in my basement right now as we speak. So when I take an onion out, normally people would cut this section off and compost this. I keep all of it. I keep the skins of the onion. I keep the kind of the old stem of the onion. I keep the husks of the garlic. I keep the skin of the squash, and I put that in the same bag. If you wanted to make vegetable broth, that's what you would make it out of. All of those vegetable kind of cutaways or cutoffs that you would normally compost. So greens, not so much, but celery, yes. You can Google how to make a good veggie broth, but I don't make vegetable broth. I just make bone broth, and I add all of those offcuts or those scraps into that stock. And the onions help to give the stock a really nice dark brown color that doesn't come from the bones. Typically, it comes from the onion skins. They add flavor. I'll add any celery cuts that I might have used for other recipes. And so wintertime for me is broth time and meal prep. And so all of your bone broths require pressure canning in order to preserve. So that's not something that you can do with a water bath canner. So if making broth, unless you're going to freeze it. So you can absolutely make bone broth and freeze it, because you can freeze just about anything. It's just, it may get freezer burn or whatever. But if you've got a big freezer, then freezing is awesome. I have 2 tiny freezers that are pretty much reserved for meat and a few other items, as you saw, all my meal prep. But otherwise, everything else is canned because I don't want to burn that much energy in freezers if I could just have it in jars, which is super quick. Okay, let's go on here. Okay, so the canning tools, what the heck do you need? I'm missing a few things from this picture, but I think I've pretty much captured the basics. So the nice thing about the All-American pressure canner, this baby, is that it can be used also as a water bath canner you just fill it with water and don't crank the lid on when it comes time to water bath. So I can use that. It's a double purpose tool, so that's how I use it. It has little grates that go on the bottom of the pot, which is required if you're going to use especially glass mason jars. If you don't have something to protect, like a little grill or a plate at the bottom of the pot, you will crack your jars. So make sure that you use something that's specifically meant for canning. I've actually even heard of people not having a canning pot or a grill and putting a dishcloth, not a dishcloth, a dish towel at the bottom of the pot. I've never done it. I won't recommend it unless I've done it, but you can research it if you don't have a grill or something. So you are going to need some jars. So these jars are brand new, but you can purchase jars from Marketplace, or you can beg, borrow, and steal from family and friends who don't preserve food anymore. That's how I got most of mine, is hand-me-downs. One of my aunts was getting out of the game, and so I got boxes and boxes. And so that once you have the jars and they're in good shape, so you have to inspect them for nicks and cracks because you can't use a damaged jar for canning. Then you only need to purchase the snap lids and sometimes some rings. So once you've got the actual jars, you are whistling Dixie to start canning. One of the other tools that is so important, and you can see, like, look at the color, that's that old olive green. These suckers are old, but I'm pretty sure they were hand-me-down somewhere in my kind of canning career. This is a jar lifter. So when the jars come out of your boiling water or your canner, you need something other than your bare fingers or an oven mitt to help lift those jars. So this is a must in my world, the jar lifter. And then another game changer are the funnels. So these are two examples of funnels. This one on the right is stainless steel, my preferred. I've had it for years and it looks brand new every single time I use it. But you can purchase a kit. This is actually, I think it's Bernardin that makes a kit with a funnel. And what is missing also from this picture is a measuring stick and a debubbler. It just looks like a stick with some grooves on it, but it helps to measure your head space, which, remember, is that kind of white air space from there to there on the jar. And it tells you, because some recipes will say 3/4 of an inch, some recipes will say 1/2 inch, some recipes will say 1 inch, and it has little increments on it that you can mark or use to measure. And it also is a long stick that you can insert down into the jar before it goes into the canner to release or move out all of the air. Because in canning, air in your canned material is not good. So you want all of those air bubbles, and that's the boiling process, forces those air bubbles up to the top and out through the seal. That's what you want. So that stick kind of helps you do that. It's a fancy little tool. I started using the end of a spatula because I didn't have one of those fancy things. So just depends on what you have. If you are going to get into fermenting, you will need some non-iodized salt. You will need some kind of container. I prefer not plastic, but a lot of people will ferment in 5-gallon buckets. So as long as it's clean, go ahead and use it. I like glass or crockery, but like I said, you can do whatever you want. So this is a crock that I purchased actually from Home Hardware. And I like it for pickles. I found that pickles in a jar was really difficult, and this is one of my big jars. So this is a 1-gallon crock, and these are called stones. And so when you ferment, any of the food that you're fermenting has to be below the surface. It is anaerobic. So you want it to be without oxygen. So that's what these large stones are for. They go on top of whatever you're preserving, and then the lid goes on. And here is the mason top that I had talked about before. If you want that product, go to the Google Mason Tops and you'll see the package that I got. And this is called fermenting pebble. And they come in a huge variety. I like these ones. See, it's got these little handles. That's key. I also have pebbles with a smooth surface, and I had to actually break one of these containers because it got stuck and I couldn't get it out and it didn't have one of these handles. So that's a good piece of advice if you are going to start fermenting. But that is another really easy entry level activity to getting into food preservation. And I would suggest starting with sauerkraut, because not only is it easy, it can be done with children. It is also absolutely delicious. And you don't, unless you're super picky about vegetables, you do not have to buy a vegetable from a grocery store for the entire winter, except for cabbage, of course. But I use it as a vegetable at meal times, or in place of store-bought vegetables or cooked vegetables over the winter. And it gives you all of that awesome gut bacteria that our bodies are craving right now, because a lot of us have been eating barcode food for a while, especially during the onset of COVID. Dehydrators. This is the one, this is the oldie that I use. I'm not even sure, maybe they don't even make it anymore. Not 100% sure. But like I said, I dehydrate a ton of different types of food, but my newest one this year was the cherry tomatoes, and they are such little treats. They're like chewy little delicious, I don't even know, I can't even explain it, but I will make these forever and ever. And you should store these in the fridge. So once they're made, although they're packed in oil, you should store them in the fridge, and try not to keep them for too long after you've made them. I've had mine for a really long time, but I just always check to make sure they're okay, but they're absolutely delicious. You could also dehydrate them and then vacuum seal them if you have a vacuum sealer, or just freeze them and take them out when you're ready to eat them. But they're delicious. The nice thing about dehydrated food is that the flavors concentrate as it dehydrates, and so anything becomes super sweet if it's already sweet, like cherry tomatoes are. So where the heck do you get your food? If anybody wants any butternut squash, you can come to my house and I'll give you some. But there's lots of different food sources that you can use. And I think people often think that you have to grow your own food in order to preserve it. And nothing is further from the truth. Basically, if you can find food, you can preserve it as long as it is in good condition. So, I mean, the sky's the limit. My preference, and the point I'm at in my life now, is to grow my own. So these are some of the seeds that I'm anxiously awaiting to kind of tear open and start. We have a couple of weeks before that happens. And people will say, well, do they have to be organic, and should it be heirloom? And you know that, to be honest, and maybe there's some people that aren't on the same kind of wavelength as I am, but honestly, I'm saying, if you're making an effort and you care enough to even try, you grow whatever you want. And you can make change. The beautiful thing about gardening is you have a new opportunity every single year. So if something doesn't work in 2020, then 2021 is a whole new shot. And if 2021 doesn't work, then you always have 2022. We have seen what food shortage could look like. It didn't happen, fortunately. Nothing worked in 2020. Yeah, 2021 is a brand new year, Adam. I fully agree. And so what I would say is just give it a shot. Order the seeds, buy the seeds off the rack that you can find in your grocery store. Yes, they are very different. Not every seed is created equal, but if you are just starting, then just go for it, and don't listen to what other people are saying, because like anything in life, if you listen to what people, the naysayers in your world, you'll never do anything. So just go for the gusto. If you don't have a lot of space, I remember somebody asking me last year, well, you have a ton of space, like what do I do if I don't have any space? So community gardens, like I think about the community garden at Fleming College. It's amazing the volume of food that comes out of that place. And a lot of smaller communities now have community gardens. Ask a friend if you can garden at their house, especially if they don't already garden. They will probably appreciate the fact that you are beautifying their landscape, and maybe share some of the produce. Grow in a pot. Like honestly, find some kind of container, cut off an old big water bottle. I don't care. Fill it with some potting soil and grow something. Like it literally is that easy. My aunt lives on the 9th story in downtown Chicago with this tiny little balcony that she grows a crazy amount of food and flowers on. So if she can do it at like 75, so can you. Find a spot, you can do it if you're heck bent on growing your own. So my answer is, first, try to grow your own or some of your own. My second source is markets. So the Lindsay Farmers Market is amazing. I try and go every Saturday throughout the summer. If I miss one, it's because I'm canning something, honestly. So go to the farmers markets as much as you can. They start usually up here early spring and go all the way into late fall. If you can't find it at a farmer's market, or you don't know or have access to a farmer's market, go to the grocery store. That's where my cabbages came from that I'm currently eating now, because you can't find a lot of produce at this time of year other than the grocery store. So yeah, wherever you can get it, get it. You would be amazed at how many people that you know grow things that have extras. So even if it's not at a market, you can ask around, does you know anybody that has extra this or extra that? And I can tell you, if it's especially the heat of the summer and the heat of the growing season, there will be extras. So take advantage of those connections and share with your friends. So I don't know what it is about tomatoes. I have this I feel like it's something about tomatoes, but I do have this massive affinity towards how beautiful tomatoes are. Sometimes, although I love them, I think I just grow them to look at them, honestly. And so here are my sweet millions. In the back, you can see zucchini. I totally overdo it, like completely overdo it every year. But the feeling that you get when you produce something as beautiful as this, plus you get to eat it and preserve it and save it for times of the year where you don't get fresh food, is amazing. So I just like the smell. Yeah, yes. And the stuff that ends up on your hands after you handle tomato plants, it's also good. So share with your friends. My friends know that they are always able to get any of my extra produce. My friend Joanna takes full advantage. So she cans up a storm with all of my leftovers. I bring it to school when we're actually at school. I remember toting in a massive garbage bag of kale once. And somebody joked and they're like, I can tell you we're in the staff room. I'm like, mm-hmm. So there's always extra. So don't let good, hard grown food go to waste if at all possible. And there's probably other places that you can think of where to get food, but those are my three big ones for food preservation. Another question that a lot of people might ask is, where do you keep all this? And so a lot of people were asking me, actually, because I would post on Facebook about what I canned and what I've been up to, and people would joke like, I'd love to see like, where the heck does all this go? So this is just one side of my pantry that it was supposed to. It is plumbed actually somewhere under all of this for a bathroom, but we don't need another bathroom. But what I did need was a place to store all the canning. So here is, I'll just go through it quick. So canned tomatoes, potatoes, carrots, green beans, corn, which we didn't grow enough of our own corn this year. So I did purchase this from a person who lives about 1 kilometer away from us. And honestly, this I will never live without again. Canned corn, like this is pressure canned. Pressure canned corn is, if you have ever eaten canned corn, is like 100 million times better. So good. Beets in the top right. This is all maple syrup, venison broth, venison meat, more venison broth, meat sauce. Maybe this is meat sauce too. One of these is vegetable. More broth. This here is rhubarb jam, canned rhubarb, peach jam, mustard pickles, canning from a friend, bread and butter pickles, canned beets, pickles. Somebody has a pickle problem in this house. Down here is rummage relish. Any brine actually that I don't use. So if I have leftover brine that I've created, this would be pickle brine. I actually can the brine. So yes, I'm that Dutch, but I just feel like you've used vinegar and sugar and it's ready to go. So all I have to do is add that brine to whatever pickles or pickled thing I'm going to make, and away we go. Vic Hines, nice to see you. Yes, mustard pickles are the best kind of pickles. I wonder why, eh? Totally. If you've never had mustard pickles, you need to try them. I'll give you a jar. Message me and I'll make sure you get a jar so you can try them. So to store your food, it should be anywhere between 10 degrees and 20 degrees Celsius, which that picture is. It was in my basement. So the cooler, the better, because again, it's that whole keeping it cool and out of direct sunlight. So that's, I just build some shelves somewhere where it's cool. That room is on a north facing wall, so it stays chilly in our basement, which has kind of lower heating or whatever. It's cooler because it's below grade. So it's a great place to store food. That's also where all my butternut squash are stored. All of my onions and potatoes I store. So I'm getting near the end here. I was trying to keep it to an hour, but this is an important question, and I left it to the end because this is not what should be hindering you from starting preserving, especially fermenting and canning, be it water bath or pressure. So is it safe? It will be safe if you follow the darn instructions. Just like anything you do, anything we do almost would not be safe, especially like I think about what I do as a professional when I was in production of culture. It was always safe because I followed the instructions and I followed the policies and protocols and procedures and all of the things we put in place to protect ourselves. And canning and fermenting is the exact same thing. So if you sterilize your jars, if you sanitize the rim before you put this snap lid on, so after you fill the jar and you filled it with the appropriate amount of headspace to say here, and this was pressure can, so that's why there's, and I probably shook it before I tried to take this picture. But before you put that rubberized snap lid on, you take a clean cloth soaked in vinegar and you wipe around the lid a couple of times to make sure it is super clean. You check for cracks or chips in that lid, and then you place the lid on. You've boiled this food already to cook it or to prepare it, because this is meat sauce. And then you put it in a pressure canner for, I can't exactly remember what meat sauce was, probably around 90 minutes because there's meat in it. And you've followed all the rules. You've made sure you've monitored your pressure canner as you're canning. Then you've done everything you can to make sure that it is safe. Then once the can cools, all of these snap lids have this kind of little dimple on top. You can't see it in this picture, but once the vacuum forms, it sucks that dimple down, and you can audibly hear when your cans are sealing, they pop or they snap, and it's like music to any canner's ears. So if you hear that snap or that pop, you know that it's sealed. Once your jars are completely cooled, you usually leave them for 24 hours without touching them. You take the rings off and you check your seal. So that's what I'm doing here. I am holding the weight of this jar over a surface. Don't do this like far off the ground or you're going to be in for a world of hurt if it didn't seal. But just put it on a surface, put your fingertips on just the snap lid and lift. And if the snap lid supports this, if the vacuum or the suction vacuum that has formed supports the weight of the jar, you're good to go. And that's another thing that I think people don't do enough, is to make sure, so after you've checked your seal, make sure you store them. All of your cans, you will have noticed in this picture that everything is stored without a ring, except for, because we didn't do this, except for our maple syrup and a few, these three here were gifts. So I didn't take the ring off, but the reason you store them with the ring off is so that if the seal loosens, so if you have bacterial growth in your jar, one of the key things that happens if you have botulism growing in your canned food is that gases are produced and that seal will blow or will become unfixed. You should never eat food where you've stored it and this seal is no longer, you can't any longer lift like this. Whoops. So if the seal is broken, do not eat the food. Get rid of it. If it doesn't seal in the preserving process, then you should refrigerate it and the food is still safe to eat. Like I'm talking same day. So if after 24 hours you check, I always check all these before I go to store them. If the seal is broken or it didn't seal, it's not that it would have broken, it's probably more like it didn't seal because food was on the rim or your lid was too tight. then you put it in the fridge and you have to eat it right away. So boohoo, you have to have some pasta that night to eat your canned food. But if it has been on your shelf for any longer than, like a day or two, and the seal is broken up to months, you must discard it. And then the other piece of advice is just to, well, I should say trust your eyes and your nose, but trust your nose. You know if food doesn't smell good. Like, we are all built with that innate ability. Unless you have a poor sense of smell, then, ask for a favor from a friend. Hey, will you smell this? I do that all the time. I say, Brian, smell that. Does that smell right? And it's usually with grocery store bought food, not my own canning stuff. But, have somebody smell it. If you see mold growing, obviously you're not going to eat it. So, play it safe, follow the instructions. That's why they're there. If you can read, you can, and you can preserve. That is like the rule for food preservation. So is it safe? It's safe if you followed all of the rules, and that you've checked to make sure your food has sealed, and that you've checked to make sure, it doesn't smell off when you go to open it. If it's fish, of course, it's going to smell off. It's going to smell fishy, but you know what I mean. And then my last slide that I get all the time is, where to start. Where would you suggest I start? So I would say start small, pick something easy where you don't have to pay a lot up front. So canning is water bath canning is a good place to start. Sauerkraut or some kind of fermentation is a good place to start. Keep it simple. Okay, this is a no-brainer. Make something that you really like. So for us, our first really big adventure was pickles, because we knew we would eat them. So try to start with something that you love, and you will want to devote the time and energy to food preservation, because it is not a quick and fast process. I will tell you that. It takes a lot of time and a lot of effort. I have kind of streamlined the process now, but I always, it usually takes the good part of a morning. So from about 5 a.m. to around noon for me to go through the entire process of a big batch of something. So you want to make sure that your time is well spent. Find a mentor, find someone who does this already that you can learn from. It's so much like, if you come to Fleming, you are probably just like me. You like to watch other people do something and learn. I like to use YouTube because I can watch them do it, and then I can do it myself. And so, start with someone who already does it, and who you might consider is an expert, or who is comfortable with their skills. Don't start by growing a giant pumpkin. I had to give my husband credit for this is Brian. It was his first year growing giant pumpkins, and he grew a 700-pound pumpkin. So don't start by growing a giant pumpkin. The amount of effort he put into growing this thing, I grew like all of our food for a year. We probably could have lived off this pumpkin for a year. Yeah, did you eat it? Actually, Nick, we didn't eat it. A lot of wildlife got to enjoy it, but we actually blew it up for open house. We did a video. The blasters came to our house, and it went down behind that tractor right down in the gully there, and they packed it full of explosives and blew it up. It was pretty awesome. Not the normal ending. I know, Adam, it wasn't a well publicized video, but I will share it with you so that you can see it. It was really amazing. Yeah. So, and my last bit of information, honestly, and tidbit, is to really just have fun, because this is something that if you start doing in a small amount, if you really get onto it, it will become a passion. It will become a way of life. And you will really get to learn a brand new skill, and something that is going to serve you as basically as long as you are on this planet, in taking control of your food, where it comes from, how it's grown, how it's preserved, how it's stored. And for me now, I like the feeling of knowing that I don't have to rely 100% on a grocery store. Trust me, I still love my barcodes, especially the sweet treats and the gummy bears. But in a time, especially during COVID, it was a huge eye opener for me how nice it is to be able to walk down into my basement and pull an entire meal off the shelf that I either grew or I harvested. So that's it's a pretty big deal. So I encourage all of you to get inspired and to try at least one thing. And then maybe by the time you're 45, like me, you'll get to the point that I'm at. What does your personal garden look like peak season? Do you have any pictures accessible? Oh man, I should have put in an entire garden photo. You know what, Adam? I don't think it is. I think I pulled all my pictures and put it on a hard drive, and it would take me a bit to find it. But yeah, I can share that with you. I'll tell you though, this year we doubled the garden size. So in at Brian's elbow, right down here, I call that the downstairs garden. We that garden patch was primarily for the giant pumpkin growing. Brian had never done it before, so we prepared a patch that was probably about 60 by 30. And as you can see, that's also where my leftover sunflowers went, but we also grew corn and butternut squash. That's why we ended up with so many butternut squash. I have a really hard time once I start the plant killing or culling the plant. So they all go in the ground. Yeah, okay, I will do that. I will do that for you, Adam. I'll send you a picture. And then our upper garden, I think is about 50 by 30 with 15 raised beds, but they're not raised beds with edges or wooden edges. They're just hilled or mounded. And we really are moving towards a no-till garden. So I really just mulch with composted hay and straw, and yeah. For some reason, the soil, we have sandy loam soil here, and it is amazing. I also have rabbits, so we get a constant supply of like cold manure. And last year, we collected some leaf bags that people that still rake leaves and then put them in paper bags to go to landfill. It's just like so weird to think about. But we collected those. So Dane is asking, do you fertilize or at all or all compost? Only compost, Dean. I don't fertilize anything. And actually, so here's a neat story about the power of compost tea. So that pumpkin right there was 700 and some pounds, and it was grown solely with compost tea. And so Brian was part of a competition with a bunch of other pumpkin growers, and I think he came second place overall. The heaviest pumpkin was 800 and some pounds or something like that. And when they found out that Brian had not used fertilizer, they were so angry, because typically you can only, if you watch or learn from giant pumpkin growers, they use all the magical, like gross, not magical. They use the like the traditional fertilizers, and they sock it to them. And I just told Brian, like, we're a non-fertilizer family here, so we'll just brew you some compost tea. So every couple of days, I brewed a big batch of compost tea, and I used it on our garden as well as the giant pumpkin. And so you can see the results. The proof is in the pudding. Compost, that's something else I would suggest, is try to start some kind of compost. If it's vermicompost, if you don't live where you have space outside, and if you do, just start a compost pile. Like, it doesn't have to be fancy. That's something else that people have this misconception, that it has to be super neat and tidy and follow all these rules. You don't really have to follow too many rules, except that the compost just takes longer. And there are some things, like try not to put meat and dairy products in your compost. But if it's a vegetable or any other kind of vegetative material, you can plop it in there. Do you worry about rabbits or other critters, or just take them as nice wildlife surprises? Oh yeah, Adam, up here we have bears, moose, deer. Groundhog is actually one of our worst. And this year we had a massive infestation of grasshoppers, which was new to me. Yeah, we just take it in stride. A lot of hand squishing for the smaller insects. This year, actually, we put up just a quick barrier for the smaller grasshoppers, and that seemed to work really well. So I just like to say that I just grow for everybody. I don't mind if you eat a little bit, but try not to eat everything. We've been really lucky, but as you can see, it's pretty open at our place right now. We've planted about 3 acres at the front of the property with trees. So soon I think we're going to have wildlife encroaching a little bit closer to our growing space, but we take it in stride. Deer love the downstairs garden there behind Brian. What are your thoughts on using eggshells in the compost? Oh yeah, they go right in there, Dawson. Never had a problem. Actually, eggshells are really great for tomato growth. I don't know if you've ever seen, oh shoot, come on, Roots and Refuge, but she swears by crushing a whole egg in the bottom of the planting hole of tomato plants because they thrive. They need that calcium. I don't use eggs. I use zebra mussels. So my mom, I grew up on the shore of Lake Erie. So I will go, when I go down to Niagara, I harvest all the zebra mussels shells because they pile up, bring them home in a bucket, and I use a sledgehammer, and I just pound the snot out of them until they're almost like a powder, like little bits. I also like to think they act as like invert control and slug control. And then I put them on top of the soil and then they disappear. So who knows if it works, but I don't separate my eggshells from the compost. Um, yeah. Yeah, so if you live in an area that has zebra mussel challenges, you can get your hands on some zebra mussels. I've included my Fleming College email, although most of you, I think I know you, so you know my email. But if you do have any other questions about preserving or growing or seed starting or I don't know, anything that has to do with, hopefully never, not even for a bit, hopefully never for zebra mussels in Kawartha Lakes. When one leaves, another one just comes. If you have any questions or any ideas or things you want to chat about, don't hesitate to reach out to me. Seed library, yes, the seed library. I don't think got enough attention at our college, but I also don't think people think they have the skills to start seeds. They don't realize how easy it can be. Some plants can be finicky, but if you start with some of the easier ones, especially if you're growing a garden, start with direct sow stuff and gain some confidence, and then get into the crazier, start indoors, this far ahead of your kind of last frost date, et cetera, et cetera. But really, you don't know unless you try, right? So you have to start somewhere. This year we're up in our game as far as indoor seed starting is concerned. So I'll report back next year. But literally, if you're sitting there right now going, I didn't learn anything on how to preserve, that was intentional, because on this kind of platform, I believe that preserving is something that you should actually do it as you're learning it. So visit YouTube, visit that website that I shared with you, and start somewhere simple. Okay, so Dawson wants to know, do I do any smart planting using plants to attract ladybugs and defer aphids? And if so, what plants do you recommend? Marigolds, smart planting as far as companion planting, if that's what you mean, Dawson, yes. There are some plants that don't like to be planted together and some that do. So is it basil and tomatoes that like to go together? So I do, but I don't know all that off the top of my head. But as far as attracting pollinators, this year I'm going for way more color to attract more pollinators. Marigolds help to deter insects. I believe in planting diversity, so I usually don't have one bed just for one thing. So normally I plant more than one plant in a specific bed so that it's not a monoculture of all the same deliciousness. But oftentimes in a garden, you can't get away from, say, all of the brassicas being hammered by cabbage looper, for an example. But honestly, I'm going to touch wood. Last year was the first year that we had the grasshopper problem, and they actually, as soon as the beets or any of the direct sow stuff came up, they basically were just nibbling at the most tender shoots as they pop through the soil. So you'd see them come up, and then the next day you'd go out and they would be flopped over, and it's like, what is going on? and the grasshoppers were so small I could barely see them. So that was the first time that I've ever had any major plant pests. So I think that has a lot to do with attracting a diversity of other predators. Like we have a bunch of bluebirds. We have a ton of fly catchers and bluebirds and birds that prey on a lot of lepidopterans. I know I've seen a ton of parasitic wasps in the garden. We have a ton of spiders. So you have to kind of plant a welcoming space for all. And then I think nature kind of will keep itself in balance. Although I do say, I have to admit, we did erect the barriers so that the grasshoppers couldn't enter the beds. And we found success that way. Aphid problem, yeah. Hand squishing. You can use soap and water. Get some nematode samples. Yeah, nematodes are great for use in gardens or even grubs and lawns. Yeah, there's lots of really cool biocontrols that you can apply. One of the things about biological controls outside in an uncontrolled environment is that they can go wherever they want. So nematodes are great because they can't move really far, so they stay where put. But things like ladybugs, you're better off, like you said, attracting them instead of like purchasing them and releasing them because they have wings. So unless you have a massive infestation, and even then some are going to take off. So it's one of those things. But aim for diversity, and in diversity you will gain success, I think, in managing pests. Should a first dehydrator be new, or can we shop around? Oh, marketplace, dude. Yes, I should have totally said marketplace. So for a dehydrator, absolutely, as long as like it works, or they can show you that it works, I would totally use marketplace. I actually I had never really explored marketplace, but now it's like the most dangerous place for me to be. And this summer, I had never heard of something called a roaster oven. So it's kind of like a crock pot, but it is like a big metal pan that goes inside of like the bigger container that has the heat. And that's what I do all of my bone broths, because you can set it like an actual oven. So it goes everywhere from, I think, warm to 150 to like 400 something degrees Celsius. So yes, marketplace is definitely, and the roaster oven that I got was brand new, never opened. So I was for half the price. So it was a huge win for me. So yes, absolutely. Marketplace or Kijiji. A pressure canner, I don't think I would buy on, I would want that new, because if the dial is damaged or any of it is damaged, you can't use it. So something like that, I would definitely get new. But for sure, a dehydrator, marketplace is the place to be. Any other questions? Okay, well, I think that wraps it up if no one has any questions. But thank you so much for coming tonight. This was an absolute pleasure to talk about something that I do a lot and I don't get to share with a lot of people. So it was nice to have this opportunity to share, and I hope that you are inspired to try to preserve at least one new thing. So make that your goal for 2021. Try and preserve at least one new thing this year. If you like pickles, I would suggest there. If you like condiments, you can make your own ketchup and mustard and toppings. That takes a lot more time, but you can do it. So you could start there. Good, Josh. Yeah, I can totally see you
Thanks.
as being a
Uh,
fermenter.
I just want to say thank you so much, Katrina. That was great, very informative, and you got me really excited for this year's harvest. Um, I just want to quickly plug next week's talk with Eric Sager. Eric Sager will be talking about invasive species and restoration landscaping and habitat restoration. And that'll be at 6 p.m. or 7 p.m. on the 16th.
Great. Thanks, Dawson. Have a great night, everybody.
Thank you all. Take care, guys.